6 months after my mother began running my house every Sunday, she stood in front of nearly 60 homeowners and told them I was too irresponsible to manage my own property. I remember the exact sound that followed. Silence. Not the polite kind. The uncomfortable kind that fills a room when everyone suddenly realizes they may have believed the wrong person. My name is Claire Bennett. I'm 38 years old, and that night, I was sitting 3 rows from the back of our neighborhood clubhouse, watching my mother, Linda, point toward me like I was a problem she had been forced to solve. She has been overwhelmed for months, Mom told the room. I've simply stepped in to protect her. A few people nodded. Daniel, my younger brother, sat near the front with his arms crossed, looking almost satisfied. Mom continued explaining that I had allowed her to take responsibility for my property and help manage HOA matters because I couldn't handle everything myself. What she didn't know was that I had spent those 6 months saving every email, every receipt, every meeting notice, and every document she had touched. And there was one document she had never seen. If you've ever had a family member rewrite your story while everyone else believed them, stay with me, because this wasn't the first time my mother had decided she knew what was best for my life. It was simply the first time I had proof. To understand how I ended up sitting in that clubhouse, I need to take you back to where this really began. My mother had always been the confident one in our family. She knew everyone's business, remembered every birthday, noticed every new car on the street, and somehow always knew what other people were doing before they told her. I was different. I was the dependable daughter, the one who answered the phone, the one who fixed problems, the one who stayed calm when Daniel made another mistake. Daniel could miss a payment, change jobs, borrow money, or disappoint Mom, and somehow the conversation would end with everyone worrying about him. If I made one mistake, Mom called it evidence that I wasn't responsible enough. After my father, Robert, died, that difference became even sharper. Mom began coming to my house more often, saying she hated being alone. I understood that. I let her stay. I made dinner. I listened to stories about Dad. My house had taken me years to buy. Every mortgage payment had come from my own work. I worked remotely from a small office upstairs, kept the place carefully, and considered it the one part of my life nobody had the right to manage for me. Then our longtime HOA volunteer stepped down. Mom offered to help. At the time, I thought she was finally trying to support me. I was wrong. The first few Sundays didn't seem dangerous. Mom would arrive around 10 in the morning carrying a canvas tote bag, 2 coffees, and a stack of HOA papers. She would spread everything across my dining table while I worked upstairs. At first, I appreciated it. She attended meetings when I couldn't. She organized complaints about landscaping. She made lists of homeowners who needed to repair fences. She even brought muffins for the board one afternoon. Then the small changes began. She started telling people, "Claire lets me handle the property matters." I corrected her once. "Mom, you're helping me with paperwork. That's all." She smiled as though I had said something childish. "I know what you mean." But she didn't correct the story. Daniel became part of it too. One evening, he called me laughing. "You know Mom basically runs that neighborhood now?" "That's not what I asked her to do. She says you're relieved to have someone responsible helping." I didn't answer. That sentence bothered me more than it should have, because it sounded exactly like something Mom would say about me when I wasn't there. At family dinners, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Mom praised Daniel for being adventurous, while criticizing me for being too rigid. When Daniel missed his share of a family expense, Mom quietly asked me to cover it. "You're more financially stable," she said. When I refused, she stared at me. "It's family, Claire." That phrase had followed me for years. Family. It meant I should lend money. Family meant I should host. Family meant I should forgive. And apparently, family meant Mom could use my dining room as an office every Sunday without asking. By the 3rd month, HOA envelopes were arriving at my house addressed to Mom. She started receiving emails at an account she had created for community business. Then she began bringing folders with labels: property, complaints, finances, board. I told her I didn't want HOA work taking over my home. She looked genuinely offended. "I'm protecting you. I didn't ask you to protect me." Her expression changed. "You're becoming very ungrateful." That was when I understood something. Mom wasn't helping anymore. She was creating a history in which I had supposedly handed her control. One Sunday, while she was making coffee in my kitchen, I opened the printer tray. A freshly printed HOA authorization form sat there. My name was typed at the bottom. My signature was missing. I stared at it for several seconds. Then I heard Mom behind me. "What are you looking at?" I turned around. "Where did this come from?" She barely glanced at the paper. "Oh, that? It's just administrative." "Why does it say I'm authorizing you?" She sighed. "Claire, don't make everything dramatic." I folded the paper and placed it inside a drawer. That night, after Mom left, I opened my laptop. I had spent years working in commercial compliance and contract administration for a regional property management company. It wasn't glamorous work, but I knew exactly how authorizations, records, meeting minutes, and delegated authority worked. Mom had always mistaken my quietness for ignorance. That was her mistake. I started downloading every HOA email connected to my property. I saved meeting notices. I photographed documents. I checked bank statements. I created a timeline of every Sunday Mom had used my home for HOA business. Then I found something worse. Several HOA expenses listed printing, supplies, refreshments, and administrative support. My name appeared beside some of them. I had never approved those expenses. I also discovered that Mom had been telling board members I had authorized her to act as my proxy on certain property matters. My hands went cold. This wasn't about helping me. She was turning my temporary permission into permanent authority. I didn't confront her, not yet. Instead, I contacted Margaret Ellis, a licensed HOA attorney, recommended through a professional connection at work. Margaret listened without interrupting. When I finished, she looked at the documents and said, "Your mother cannot make herself the owner of your property because she creates paperwork saying so." I exhaled. But you need to correct the record before the annual meeting." She pushed the papers into a neat stack. "Don't threaten her, Claire. Don't accuse her of things you can't prove. Document everything." I nodded. Margaret looked directly at me. Then she asked the question that made my stomach tighten. "Does your mother know who actually owns the house?" I knew exactly what she meant. And suddenly, the 6 months of Sunday mornings didn't look like a family favor anymore. They looked like preparation for something Mom had been planning all along. Margaret became more than the attorney reviewing my paperwork. She became the first person in years who didn't ask me to make my mother comfortable. When I told her how Mom had always treated Daniel differently, Margaret didn't say, "But she's still your mother." She said, "Claire, being someone's daughter doesn't mean surrendering your judgment." I wrote that sentence down. I needed to. Because I had spent most of my life believing that keeping peace was the same thing as being a good daughter. Margaret helped me organize everything into 3 folders. The first contained my property deed and HOA bylaws. The second contained emails and financial records. The third contained a dated timeline of Mom's activities. Then another person stepped forward. Her name was Evelyn Harper. She had lived in our neighborhood for almost 20 years and had previously served as the HOA treasurer. We met at a coffee shop after she called me unexpectedly. "I've been meaning to talk to you," Evelyn said. She lowered her voice. "Your mother has been asking questions." "What kind of questions?" "About access, vendor accounts, financial records, board authority." My stomach tightened. Evelyn explained that Mom had proposed creating a permanent position called Community Operations Coordinator. It sounded harmless. It wasn't. The position would give Mom considerable influence over vendors, records, and day-to-day HOA operations. "Is the board considering it?" I asked. Evelyn nodded. "They're voting at the annual meeting." That was the moment I understood what Mom had been building. The Sunday meetings weren't just about my house. My house had been the stage on which she practiced becoming the person everyone depended on. Evelyn looked at me carefully. She told several homeowners the annual meeting will be the night you finally admit you can't manage the property. I felt something inside me go completely still. For years, those words would have destroyed me. That day, they simply clarified the situation. I wasn't walking into a family argument anymore. I was walking into a meeting where my mother had prepared a story about me, and she believed everyone would accept it. The weeks before the meeting became tense. Mom continued arriving every Sunday with her folders and coffee, as though nothing had changed. Finally, I stopped her at the door. No more HOA work in my house. She stared at me. Excuse me? You heard me. Her face hardened. After everything I've done for you? I appreciate the help you gave me. I don't agree to this continuing. She gave a small, bitter laugh. You wouldn't have a house this nice without me. I looked at her. That sentence stayed with me. Because every mortgage payment had come from my paycheck. Every repair had come from my savings. Every night I had worked late had been mine. Yet somehow, my mother had started believing that anything I built belonged partly to her. The official HOA agenda arrived the next morning. Mom's proposed appointment was listed as a formal vote. I called Margaret. Can I speak at the meeting? You're the homeowner, she said. You can clarify the record. And if she lies? Don't fight her story with emotion. Margaret paused. Bring documents. So I prepared 3 folders. One for Mark Reynolds, the HOA president. One for the secretary. One for myself. I didn't tell Mom. The night before the meeting, she called me. I hope you'll do the mature thing tomorrow, she said. What does that mean? It means supporting your mother. I looked at the folders sitting on my desk. For once, I didn't feel the need to defend myself. I'll be there, I said. Then I hung up. The next evening, I carried those folders into the clubhouse. And inside one of them was the document Linda Bennett had never expected to see. The annual HOA meeting was held on a warm Saturday evening in our neighborhood clubhouse. By the time I arrived, almost 60 homeowners were already inside. I recognized most of the faces. People I had waved to while collecting my mail. People I had spoken to about snow removal, broken sidewalks, and neighborhood cookouts. People who had known me for years. And yet, when I walked through those doors, I felt as though I were entering a room where everyone had already been told who I was. Mom stood beside Mark Reynolds, the HOA president. She looked completely comfortable. She wore a cream-colored jacket, carried a thin black folder, and smiled at people as they entered. Daniel was sitting near the front. When he saw me, he gave me a small nod. I took a seat 3 rows from the back. I didn't want to sit beside my mother. I didn't want to look frightened either. Mark called the meeting to order. There were routine matters first. Landscaping, budget approval, a discussion about replacing damaged fencing near the community entrance. Then Mark reached the final item. Next, we have the proposed appointment of Linda Bennett as Community Operations Coordinator. Mom stood. She thanked the board. Then she began telling the story she had rehearsed for months. Over the past 6 months, she said, I've stepped in because Claire has been overwhelmed. My chest tightened. She tore her gaze away from her ruined footwear, still very much grieving the loss, and set herself to the task of finding a dry place to stand. Then she said the sentence that made several people turn toward me. Claire asked me to take responsibility for the property because she knew she couldn't handle it alone. That wasn't true. Not even close. But I stayed seated. Mom held up the authorization form. I've only done what my daughter asked me to do. Someone behind me whispered. I could feel my face getting warm. For 1 second, I was 17 again, sitting at our kitchen table, while Mom explained why my feelings were always making things difficult. Then I remembered Margaret. Don't fight the story before the evidence is on the table. Mark looked at me. Claire, do you dispute this? I stood. My knees felt strangely calm. Yes, I said. Mom's smile disappeared. I dispute the document, the authority it claims to give, and the story being told about why it exists. A few people shifted in their chairs. Mom immediately interrupted. Claire, please don't do this. I looked at her. I've been trying not to do this for 6 months. Mark raised a hand. Linda, let her finish. Mom sat down. Mark asked whether I had documentation. Yes. I walked toward the secretary. My folder felt heavier than it should have. I handed her the first copy, the deed, then the HOA correspondence, then the emails, then the expense records, then the timeline. I didn't explain every page. I didn't need to. The room became quieter with every document. Mark picked up the final page of the first packet. His expression changed. He looked at Mom. "Linda," he said slowly, "why did you tell us this was signed?" Mom's face tightened. "It was understood." Mark frowned. "Understood isn't the same as signed." "No," Mom said. "Claire gave me verbal permission." I looked at her. There it was. The version of reality she had been depending on. The room waited. I opened my second folder. Inside were the records Mom had never known I had preserved. I showed the emails where I had clearly told her the arrangement was temporary. I showed the dates of the Sunday meetings. Then I placed a printed message on the table. It was from Mom to Daniel. The message read, "Once the board approves me, she won't be able to push me out anymore." Daniel's face went pale. Mom immediately said, "That was taken out of context." I didn't respond. Margaret, who had been sitting quietly near the side wall, finally spoke. "The documents don't establish criminal wrongdoing," she said calmly, "but they do establish that the board was given an inaccurate impression of Claire's consent." Mark looked around the room, then he closed the folder. "The vote is paused." Mom stared at him. Evelyn stood from her seat. "I need to clarify something," she said. She explained that Linda had repeatedly discussed taking over HOA operations and had presented the arrangement with Claire as more permanent than it actually was. Mom looked at me as though I had betrayed her. But I hadn't. I had simply stopped protecting a story that wasn't true. Mark gathered the documents. "Before we proceed," he said, "Linda, I have one question." Mom looked up. The entire room seemed to hold its breath, and I already knew what he was going to ask. Mark looked directly at my mother. "Linda, did Claire ever give you written permission to represent yourself as the person responsible for her property?" Mom didn't answer immediately. Her fingers tightened around the edge of her folder. Finally, she said, "She gave me verbal permission." I heard a quiet breath escape someone behind me. I looked at my mother. "I gave you permission to help me," I said. "I never gave you permission to become me." Nobody moved. For years, I had thought strength meant finally saying everything I had swallowed. That night, I learned strength could also mean saying only what was necessary. I opened the timeline. "January 14th, I said. "I asked Mom to help organize some HOA records because my workload was heavy." I turned the page. "February 3rd. I told her the arrangement was temporary." Another page. "March 18th. Her first administrative expense was submitted without my approval." Mom shook her head. "You're making this sound deliberate." I looked at her. "I don't have to make it sound like anything." I placed another document on the table. "The records speak for themselves," I continued. April 9th. She requested expanded access. May 22nd. I discovered the authorization form. June 11th. She proposed becoming Community Operations Coordinator. Mark listened carefully. Then I handed him the final document. It was a signed statement from Evelyn, the former HOA treasurer, confirming that I had never transferred authority over my property to Mom, and that Mom had repeatedly described our temporary arrangement as something more permanent. Mom's face changed. "You went behind my back." Evelyn answered before I could. "No, Linda." Claire asked questions. "That's not going behind your back." Mom looked toward Daniel. He stood. "This is ridiculous. She's been planning this whole thing just to embarrass Mom." I felt the old instinct to defend myself. Then I let it pass. Mark turned toward Daniel. "This isn't a family court. We're reviewing an HOA proposal." Daniel sat back down. Mom looked at me. "After everything I've done for you, you're choosing these people over your own mother?" That sentence could once have broken me. Instead, I finally gave her the answer I had been avoiding. "I'm not choosing strangers over you. I'm choosing reality over the version of me you created because it was easier to control." The room went completely silent. Mom looked away. Mark reviewed the documents again before announcing that the proposed appointment would not move forward. The board would also review the expenses Mom had submitted and correct the HOA records concerning my property. Future communications involving my house would come directly to me unless I provided written authorization. No shouting, no dramatic removal, No police, just a decision recorded in the minutes. And somehow, that felt more powerful than anything I could have said. Daniel walked out first. Mom stayed seated for several moments. I didn't feel victorious. I felt tired. Outside the clubhouse, the evening air was cooler than I expected. I had almost reached my car when I heard Mom behind me. "Claire." I stopped. She caught up with me, her expression no longer confident. "You don't understand what this will do to our family." I looked at her. "I understand exactly what it will do." She stared at me. "It will make everyone see what happened." She lowered her voice. "You could have handled this privately." I tried. "You should have trusted me." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because that was the one thing she was asking from me, after spending 6 months proving I shouldn't. I got into my car. Mom stood beside the driver's door. "Are you really going to do this to me?" I shook my head. "No, Mom." I started the engine. "You did this to yourself." The next morning, the HOA office contacted me. They were beginning a formal review of the expenses Mom had submitted. Several neighbors apologized. Others admitted they had noticed her behavior, but hadn't known how to challenge it. Daniel, however, was furious. He told relatives that I had staged the entire confrontation. I didn't correct him. For the first time, I didn't feel responsible for making everyone agree with my version of the truth. Mom called repeatedly. Sometimes she cried, sometimes she was angry, sometimes she said I had misunderstood everything. Then, late Sunday afternoon, I received a message from her. "I want to come over next Sunday. We need to talk like mother and daughter." I stared at the screen. For 6 months, Sundays had belonged to her. Now I wasn't sure whether I was ready to give one back. Mom came the following Sunday without a folder. That was the first thing I noticed. No HOA papers, no envelopes, no coffee cups balanced on top of documents, just my mother standing on my porch with her hands folded in front of her. "I miss you," she said. I opened the door wider, but didn't invite her inside immediately. She looked at me. "I know you're angry." "I was angry," I said. "I'm not anymore." She seemed surprised. "I want to explain." So I let her talk. She told me she had felt useful. She said she thought the neighborhood respected her more when she was involved. She said she believed I needed someone to help me. Then came the familiar words. "I was only trying to help. You misunderstood what I was doing. You should have told me sooner." I listened quietly. When she finished, I said, "I can accept that you believed you were helping. I can't accept responsibility for the choices you made." Her eyes filled with tears. "Can't we just forget the meeting?" "No." She looked hurt. "I thought you forgave me." Forgiveness and access aren't the same thing. That was the boundary I had needed for years. I told her Sundays were no longer available for HOA business, family negotiations, or arguments about my home. "If we have a relationship," I said, "it has to be between a mother and daughter, not between someone controlling my life and someone constantly trying to keep the peace." Mom didn't answer. After a few minutes, she walked back to her car. I watched from the window. For once, I didn't feel guilty. Months passed. The HOA continued without Mom's involvement in my property. The financial review was handled through normal procedures, and the records were corrected. Daniel and I barely spoke. That hurt, but I stopped chasing people who required me to abandon myself before they would call me family. My Sundays changed too. I started walking to a little coffee shop near the park. I worked in my garden. Sometimes Evelyn came over. Sometimes I invited friends for dinner. One Sunday morning, I sat at the same dining table where Mom had spent 6 months spreading HOA folders across my life. The table was empty, no paperwork, no accusations. No demands, just my coffee and the sunlight coming through the kitchen window. I realized my mother hadn't legally taken my house, but for 6 months, she had made me feel as though I needed permission to decide what happened inside it. Taking that feeling back was the real victory. I still loved my mother. I simply understood that loving someone didn't mean giving them the keys to your life. And if you're listening to this because someone in your family has mistaken your kindness for permission, remember this: you don't have to become cruel to become strong. Sometimes strength is a document. Sometimes it's a closed door. Sometimes it's a quiet no, and sometimes it's simply choosing yourself after years of being taught not to. For 6 months, my mother owned every Sunday in my house. Now, when Sunday morning comes, I open the curtains, make my coffee, and remember what I should have known all along. My home is mine. And so is my life. If this story reminded you of someone in your own family, share your experience in the comments. And if you've ever had to choose peace over people-pleasing, subscribe for more stories about boundaries, betrayal, and finding your way back to yourself.